Twilight Struggle is a two-player game that simulates a conflict between the USSR and the USA during the Cold War. It's a card-driven game, and the events on the cards that you'll be playing each turn will take you through a vast array of historical happenings between the years of 1945 and 1989. There is a lot to this game, and because there's a lot to this game, let's jump right in. Let's have a closer look at it. Pictured in this review is the Deluxe Edition's components. We have the mounted board representing the map of the world with numerous tracks on it to keep tabs on elements of gameplay. It also has a turn sequence and other information printed on the board, which is really helpful, particularly during your first few plays of the game. I noticed that my edition had a stain on the board, but I checked the Board Game Geek forums and found out that it was just part of the artwork, after tearing apart my gaming cupboard to look for a water leak though. Anyway, the cards included are not plastic coated, which I'm usually a big fan of, particularly in card-driven games, but I'm not sure I'm going to sleeve these ones. You'll also get some dice in the game and thick chits, and these chits will be used to represent a number of things in the game, mainly a superpower's influence in a country. I chose to store these chits in small containers. The containers pictured here can be found at just about any variety store. I do believe their intended use is to store medication. They also fit really nicely back in the game box. In the game, you're also going to get some player's aids, which are quite sort of plain looking, but I think that's a benefit because they're really clear and really useful during play because of that. And of course, you get yourself a rulebook. Now, we're going to move on to the gameplay overview, but it's worth mentioning that there is at all times a lot of decisions to make and a lot to this game, so it's very hard to put it in an overview that's going to truly show you the depth of the game, so I'm just going to show you the basics. Okay, so let's have a look at a very brief overview of the game of Twilight Struggle. There is more than one way to obtain a victory in this game, all of which having influence in countries or attempting to gain influence in countries is going to assist you in a victory. Twilight Struggle's core mechanic is driven by playing cards. Players in a round will have the opportunity to play several cards from their hand. The deck of cards players will draw their hands from is divided into 3 separate decks: early war, mid-war, and late war cards. Players will begin with only the early war deck available. The mid-war and late war decks will get shuffled into the draw deck during later rounds. So if gaining influence is going to help you meet the majority of winning conditions, how do we get influence on the board? Well, you can get influence by playing cards for either the events listed on the cards or the operations points. When playing a card for an event, this will have you follow the event described in the text. Events will be different, and a lot of them will have to do with placing or removing influence. Events will be associated with one superpower or both. For example, a red star indicates the event is associated with the USSR player, and a white star indicates that the event is associated with the USA player. A split red and white star indicates that the card's event is associated with both sides. For example, if the USSR player played this card, Fidel, for the event, which the star indicates that the event is associated with the USSR player would remove all USA influence in Cuba, and the USSR will gain sufficient influence to control Cuba. Let's have a look at the other option, playing a card for the operations points. When you choose to play a card for the operations points, the points can be used in one of 3 ways that will see you place and/or remove influence. A player can choose to place influence chits at a cost of 1 operations point per 1 influence. However, if the opposing player controls the country in which you are trying to extend your influence to, this sees the cost of operations points increased. To be said in control of a country, a player needs to have influence in that country to a number equal to or greater than the stability number listed on the country's space on the board. The player will also need to exceed any of the opposition's influence in that country, if any, by at least that stability number as well. When a player meets the criteria for control, that player flips their influence token over to its other side. This indicates control in that country. This makes it very easy to distinguish the difference between players with influence in a country and players with control of a country. Operations points can also be used to do realignment rolls, which cost 1 operation point per die roll. These rolls are used to try and reduce the opposition's influence in a targeted country. How much influence will be removed is dependent on how successful the roll is. The die rolls are modified by other circumstances of the game. Operations points on a card can also be used to do 1 coup attempt. A coup represents operations short of full-scale war to change the composition of a target country's government. This again will remove influence from your opponent in the targeted country if successful. On a successful result, it is not only possible to remove your opponent's influence from a country, but it may see you gain influence in the country in the process. This again is dependent on how successful your attempt was. Coups will also involve a modified die roll, but it is modified differently than the realignment rolls. I won't get into the details of how the die rolls are modified, but I will say whilst of course the die roll itself includes luck, the modifiers can be worked into your strategy to take the edge off the luck of the roll. Coup attempts can affect another very important part of gameplay. Doing coup attempts in some countries will reduce the DEFCON level. This level measures nuclear tension between the superpowers. Reducing the DEFCON level introduces limitations on what regions players can attempt coup and realignment rolls. The limitations are listed on the DEFCON levels track, so it's very easy to keep tabs on which regions the limitations affect. Having the limitations enforced by the DEFCON level can be a good thing. I lost a game recently because a DEFCON level wouldn't allow me to do realignment rolls or coup attempts in Europe, and it was at a time that I desperately needed to be able to do that, and it played a big part in my loss of the game. Doing a coup attempt will also have you move your military operations marker up on the associated board's track. At the end of the turn, players must have made a certain number of military operations or they are deducted victory points. The number of required military operations is that of the current DEFCON level, so doing coup attempts in some countries will reduce the number of required military operations that you will need to do per turn. So, that's a very basic overview of some of the elements of gameplay. But how does influence help you score points and, well, help you win? Often in a player's hand of cards they will come across a regional scoring card. When played, and scoring cards must be played if the player gets one, this will see players get victory points depending on their influence. The number of victory points a player will receive is determined by how many controlled countries and what controlled countries the player has in that region, along with a few modifiers for other circumstances. I won't get into the details of how many controlled countries you would need to score what victory points and so forth, and I won't get into the details of all the winning conditions either. The rulebook is available for download in the Board Game Geek forums if you'd like to have a closer look at those aspects of the game. So that concludes the very, very brief overview of the game of Twilight Struggle. And whilst on the subject of the rulebook, I will say that the rulebook is written really well. I must say that I found this game pretty difficult to learn, but unlike other games I've found hard to learn, it wasn't because the rulebook left a lot unsaid or was unclear or was hard to reference to during plays of the game. It's just that there's a lot to learn and a lot to soak in. I knew that I'd also struggle teaching a game of this depth. My opponent and I had agreed that our first game would only run for an hour just so we could get to know the mechanics a bit. We ended up playing for 2.5 hours and went until the end of the 8th round. The next time we played, I made sure the experience would be even more comfortable and themed with the assistance of Baltica for the USSR player and Budweiser for the USA player. Our second game actually only went for an hour and 10 minutes and I lost at the end of the 4th round due to Europe falling to the USSR player during a scoring round, which is one of the instant winning conditions of the game. I also just wanted to quickly touch base on something I found really interesting. One of the other winning conditions is if a player reaches 20 victory points on the victory point track, but the victory point track only has one marker. So it's not the first to gain 20 victory points, it's the first to reach 20 on the track. Throughout the game, it's like a victory point tug of war. Because of the history and the mechanics and it all being really well suited to the theme and working really well together, it really does feel as though you're playing through the Cold War. I always felt in our games, because of how well it all matched up, that there was a lot at stake and it created a lot of tension between the players, which is something I really love in a game. Now, I mentioned the mechanics really sort of supporting the theme, and what I mean by that is a successful coup attempt had me feeling pretty damn powerful. Holding a scoring card made me feel like I had the upper hand over the other player, just that bit of control over him. Not meeting the military requirements and losing victory points made me feel like the weaker superpower. Scoring a lot of victory points brings a certain feeling of security, but only temporarily. Unfortunately, we're already out of time, but I'll end it by saying it's a fantastic experience, brilliant design, Usually games that run over 2 hours, and this one can run around the 3 hour mark, they usually have me a bit bored, after the 2 hour period, but that's not been the case in this game. It's really entertaining. I'll be doing a written review on Twilight Struggle on Board Game Geek to coincide with this review, just so I can cover a bit more ground, but in the meantime, thanks for watching everyone, and I hope to see you all again soon.